Hello guys, so it's the end of July and our vegetable garden has produced massive amounts of vegetables for us this year. We fought diseases, insects, and things like that, but there's one insect that can completely decimate specifically your tomatoes, your peppers, and they can get on there and overnight your entire plant can be destroyed. So I'm going to show it to you and I'm going to show you 10 different ways you can get it under control. But before we go into the greenhouse, I want to show you some tomato plants I had in buckets that have just been decimated by this. They were off to the side and I really wasn't caring for them the way I should have. But I'll show you what kind of damage this particular type of insect can do. And again, I'm going to show you how to get rid of it as well. So guys, these tomato plants have just been eaten alive by this particular type of insect. And in a matter of hours, overnight, these were just really decimated. But it's one of those things that just happens sometime in the garden. You can't control everything. There's no way you can get everything under control. But I'm going to show you this insect, ways to identify what it is, and there's two different varieties of this insect. I've got about half a dozen of these tomato plants in buckets that have just been really attacked by this. So let's go into the greenhouse and I'll show you 10 ways to get it under control and how to identify exactly what it is. Now, a couple days ago, I actually captured one and I put it in this jar with a couple of leaves from my peppers because I wanted to keep it alive so you could see exactly how to identify it. There's two types, like I said, and it's real easy to identify. And also there's some clues that it's there even if you don't see it. So I'm going to show you up close. I'm going to get the camera right in here. You can see exactly what I'm talking about. All right, let's see if we can carefully remove our little friend here, our garden invader, around our pepper plants. I had to sacrifice a few limbs there. And this is a tomato hornworm. He's stuck to this limb. Now they're not going to hurt you, even though there's a spiked horn here. I don't know if you can see that, but it's basically just a docile, harmless insect. And although it looks scary, there's two types of hornworms. You have the tomato and the tobacco. Now the tobacco just has these single white line stripes. I hope you can see that clearly. But this is a tobacco hornworm. Now you also have the tomato hornworm. It's going to have a V pattern on these little white stripes you can see down there. Now there's a couple of ways you can identify that you have hornworms, and this hornworm has been in this jar for about 24 hours. And the surprising thing is these are actually the droppings of the hornworm, and a lot of times these will end up on the leaves of your tomato peppers and you'll see them there and you may not even pay any attention to it. So that's one of the ways you can identify that you have one of the two types of hornworms, tomato or tobacco, is the droppings laying on top of the leaves. Now, I'm going to let him go back into the wild, but I'm going to take him far away from my garden so he can burrow down into the soil and become, I believe it's sometimes called a hawk moth, sometimes it's called a hummingbird moth, but it just becomes a moth once it goes through this winter state underground and it pops out in the springtime and starts the life cycle all over again. So that's what we're looking at. But these truly can go through a tomato. They're voracious eaters. They can go through a tomato plant in a matter of 24 hours and just destroy it. So I'm going to give you 10 tips on how to get them under control to prevent them from attacking and just devastating your garden. Especially in this case, these are some, like I said earlier, these are my pepper plants. I sacrificed a couple of branches there so this could survive inside the jar for about 24 hours before I have to release it back into the wild. But if you've ever seen the movie A Bug's Life, this is probably what one of the characters was what appeared to be overweight caterpillar. It was very green, if you remember that movie from about 20 years ago. Now these are the variety of my pepper plants that have been a little bit lackluster in producing this year, and they do sometimes produce much better after July is over. So maybe they'll do a little bit better as the year goes by. But this is where I found the hornworm on one of my pepper plants. And so the simplest and the first way to get them under control is to manually remove them by hand. Now, if you're squeamish about touching them, you can use a pair of gloves. And the best time to do that, believe it or not, is after dark, when it's completely dark outside, and use one of these black light flashlights. Go around the garden, shine it on your plants, and the hornworm almost glows. It stands out from the leaves. It's very easy to spot. So just do that maybe once a week, once summer is middle way over. In your area, it may be earlier, but in my area, it's about the middle of summer where I have to go out and manually look for these in the garden after dark. I've only found 2 this year, so it's been a pretty good year, and I guess my previous methods have paid off. But remember, I'll put a link in the description. A black light flashlight is the simplest, most organic way to remove the hornworms from your garden. Now, you can release them somewhere else and they'll eventually make their way back to the soil if they've eaten enough and they're ready to go into that next state of becoming a moth. So just remember that you don't have to kill them, but if you do decide you want to kill them, just take a bucket filled with soapy water and you can just drop them in there, especially if you have an infestation. If you just have one or two, you can relocate them, but if your garden is just completely overrun with them, you probably want to go ahead and get rid of them this year so they don't reproduce and come back to your garden next year. Now, method number 2 for getting rid of your hornworms or preventing them is to bring in natural predators that are going to eat them when they're in their smaller stages, and it's much harder for us to spot them and find them. But there's 3 in particular that are very good. One is ladybugs. They can eat them when they're really, really small. Lacewing, a little almost transparent insect, they'll come in and do that. Also, parasitic wasps can help. There's a wasp, I have on the side of my greenhouse, a wasp house it's made out of bamboo, and I can put a link to it in the description if you're interested in putting one of those up around your property. Number 2 is birds. Birds are great to have in the garden. Putting a bird feeder with maybe not full of food, but just a little bit of food, they'll attract them to your garden, and then they'll go out into the garden and look for these things. But also bird houses around your garden. I've got a few bird houses placed strategically around the perimeter of the garden, so they'll come into the garden and look for insects naturally. Now, a third one that a lot of people don't think about is making a toad habitat in a shady area in the garden. Use something like a trash can lid. You can fill it up with sand, water, and some stones, and that will attract a lot of toads to the garden, and they'll also go out into the garden. Sometimes you can use something like a small lid to a bucket and put in the area directly under your tomatoes or your peppers, and that will also attract just a little bit of standing water. Make sure you put some of the mosquito bits into the water. I think I've talked about that many times, but I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But the mosquito bits, sprinkle that in the water. You'll have no insects in it, but that standing water will attract toads over the summer, especially if you put it out early in the spring and leave it there keep it filled with water. That will attract toads to the garden, especially if you have it directly under your vegetables. The toads will go up into the vegetables, tomatoes, and things and eat the insects. So that's a great natural way to do it. So of those 3, I like the birdhouses best because I think those are the most effective. Now, another thing you can do is do companion planting. I've planted this basil right here with my cucumbers, and that's probably repelled some of the hornworms from this area. I haven't found any yet, so I'm going to keep taking a look every evening until I'm sure there's no hornworms anywhere else in the garden. But doing companion planting with things like basil, marigold, and dill, planting that around your vegetables, that can act as a repellent, and of the last 2, marigold and dill, can attract some of the parasitic wasps that can lay eggs on the back of the hornworm. So bringing in those predators is really important because it saves you from having to use a more harmful and toxic pesticide. But I'll talk about some natural solutions that's completely harmless to people, but it works really well on getting rid of the hornworms if you decide to use an overall spray on the garden. Now, if you want to spray your plants with something that's completely harmless to humans but absolutely toxic to the hornworms, is BT, and I'll put a link down below to where you can get BT. I think they sell it on Amazon, eBay, but I'll put a link to it. But anyways, BT is a stomach poison to the hornworm. Safe for humans again, but it's perfectly okay to use in your vegetable garden, completely organic. But the way it works is it's a poison to the stomach. They'll stop feeding in a very short amount of time and they'll die. Of course, application may require you to do it every 7 to 10 days and after a heavy rain. So BT is one of those things that can really help you with hornworms if you have the time to do weekly sprayings. Now, neem oil is another product you can use that disrupts the hormones of the hornworm and also stops them from feeding, and ultimately they die and wither up and go away. So neem oil concentrate, that's 100% pure neem oil. That's what you want to use. You don't want to use one that's diluted with something else or it's a mix. It's what needs to be pure neem oil. And spraying the undersides of the leaves are critical because when they're in their very small state, you won't see them, but you want to spray the leaf underside of your tomatoes and your peppers. And using something like this, a solo sprayer where you can adjust the angle, you can go up under the leaves and spray from beneath, and it's a lot easier to do it with one of these. I'll put a link to one of these as well. If you have a large garden and you want a larger sprayer, I found that this particular one has done great. I'll put a link to it. Now, the great thing about this sprayer, it is battery powered. You can use a 20-volt battery from Black & Decker, and it's lasted me, I believe I've had this 3 or 4 years. I bought this around 2019, early 2020, and it's worked great. I use these specifically for each product I'm using, so I don't mix products. I believe I have 3 of these now. So just remember, if you do get one of these, don't mix harsh chemicals with it because some of the residue could still be in system, and you definitely don't want that being sprayed on your vegetables. So spraying the underside of those leaves are critical, and I'll put links to all the products I'm using as well. Now, Diatome Earth is another product that's perfectly safe for humans. Obviously, you don't want to breathe it in or get it into your eyes because it is a powder. It's not harmful. It's not toxic to humans other than that irritation in your eyes or in your lungs. So just remember, be careful when you're putting this out. But I usually just take a plastic used container like this, drilled holes in it, and then I just kind of sprinkle it throughout the garden. There is somewhere around my vegetable area in here, I keep it stored, but it's not in view right now. But it is a handheld pump type sprayer for powders like this that will kind of float around in the air around your thing. You want to wear a mask and eye protection when you're using it. I'll put a link to that as well in the description. But you just want to make sure you do this after a rain, because once the Diatome Earth becomes wet, it's not effective anymore. So doing this probably maybe once every week to 2 weeks and after there's a heavy rain. Now, using row covers is the ultimate way to keep insects off your vegetables, but the flip side of that is a lot of your pollinators are not going to be able to get in there, so you might have to manually do it with a toothbrush, or with tomatoes you can shake the plant and allow some of that pollen to float around underneath. But if you're plagued with all sorts of insects, specifically hornworms, you can use these row covers to go over your plants, your trees, anything. You can get them in a lot of different sizes. And I even have them on a persimmon tree. They're the size of a small bag. I put them on each persimmon to keep the persimmons from being attacked from various insects. But for hornworms, row covers works great. Just remember, it might limit the pollination and the pollinators, so you may have to do that manually. So I use mostly container gardening for most of my vegetables, either buckets or raised beds. But hornworms, there's a key to a hornworm that you can get them under control next year. Let's say you had a few hornworms this year, then the following year you were just inundated with hornworms. That's because once they get through their feeding stage, they go down into the soil and they reproduce. And so each year you might have more and more hornworms growing in your soil. So tilling the soil is very important. Turning it over, exposing the pawpaw that's down, did I say that right? Anyways, it's in that state where it's kind of like a butterfly. In between the worm and the moth is that state they're in the ground. So getting that soil turned over and exposing them and destroying them in that state will help you the following year. So remember, you want to make sure you till your soil, but do it in the fall once they're in the ground. Now, crop rotation is good for diseases, but it's also good for hornworms. Moving what you plant in this bed, you move it to another bed. That deprives the hornworm of its preferred plant that it wants to feed off of. So remember, by doing crop rotation, you're not only helping with diseases, but you're preventing the hornworm from getting established over and over in that place. Tilling is important. Crop rotation is just as important to deprive them of the plants they want the most. Now, I spent the afternoon looking for parasitic wasp. I found one listing on eBay. Unfortunately, that was no longer available. I searched Amazon, I searched the web in general. So maybe this is an early spring thing. I've never ordered parasitic wasp online before, but if you can get them early in the season and release them into the garden, they will attack the hornworms, lay their egg sacs on the back of the hornworm. I'll show you a picture right here of what that looks like. It looks like little pieces of cotton on the back of the hornworm, and that kills the hornworm. It's just a natural predator. I think I mentioned that earlier. So that is number 10. If you can get your hands on some parasitic wasp, if I do find a listing for some company that's selling those, I'll put it in the link below. But that's just one of those long shot things. If you can find the eggs, put them in the garden early in the season, just after you're past your last frost, then that might help you the most if you can find them. So guys, I want to say thanks so much for watching. I hope you have found some information there. You'll like and subscribe. Please note that I get dozens and dozens and dozens of questions every day, and so generally I will answer questions to anybody who's subscribed to the channel, because I can filter the questions that way. But there's so many questions coming in, I just would spend an hour to 2 hours a day answering questions. So if you want your question answered, please do a public subscription, be a public subscriber. If you subscribe and you're not listed publicly, your subscription isn't, I'll never see that comment in the public subscriber. So please do that, and I will definitely answer your question and do the best I can to give you the most accurate answer. So guys, have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed the video.